So it's a bit odd that I've been asked to come and speak to a bunch of law students and teachers of law on the topic of network neutrality, because it's perhaps, it was February of this year when I knew nothing at all about network neutrality, and the organization that I work for, which is 7.5 years old, on its website have published only a single blog entry on network neutrality. So you could think of me as a fraud or a charlatan, because it's quite odd that somebody who has very little research experience in the field is being asked to comment on this question. But many people on the internet, especially those associated with the Save the Internet campaign, were not satisfied with what we were doing. We were staying silent because we claimed we didn't know this field and therefore we couldn't comment. As researchers, we said we could only comment on matters of policy where we have done some amount of research. But then some of the supporters of the Save the Internet campaign said, that's not true, because you get funding from Wikimedia Foundation. Wikimedia Foundation is one of the 26 destinations that are zero rated under Facebook's walled garden, which used to be called Internet.org and is now called Free Basics, and therefore the Center for Internet and Society is compromised ideologically, and that's why CIS is remaining silent. It's because the donors of CIS don't want CIS to have an opinion on this topic, which is network neutrality. So then we were forced to say something. But there are two big problems with producing evidence-based policy on network neutrality. The first is that network neutrality is a very complex question, and there are a variety of phenomena, policies that come into play when one tries to understand the ramifications of violations or compliance with network neutrality policy. So just to go through the quick list, you might have to worry about competition law, you might have to worry about consumer protection law, you might have to think through implications of spectrum policy, you might have to know signal processing capacity of mobile technologies, you might have to be aware of the existing traffic management practices that ISPs follow on their networks. You might have to have some understanding of game theory, because you have no idea how this multi-sided market is going to react to various policy interventions. You might also need to know economics. So there's a whole range of areas of policy and research that you might want to be familiar with, and often, or perhaps it's absolutely impossible, for a single human to have expertise in all these areas. So how does anybody speak authoritatively about network neutrality? That's problem number one. It's a complex phenomena, and when we're dealing with complex phenomena, very difficult for us to apply the scientific method and for us to ascribe causality, because in the world of evidence-based policy formulation, we have this phrase which is evidence, which is also used in the world of science and emerges from the design of natural experiments, and usually evidence is used to explain phenomena or to ascribe, and part of that explanation is ascribing causality. The most popular method of doing this, of course, is regression analysis. And the second thing is that it's a fast-moving space. So there is no time to do the research. What some of the defenders of network neutrality say is the harms are irreversible. So once a particular product or service is entrenched in the marketplace, then you may not be able to undo it. It might be the case that since the Indian market is still very nascent. By the time we reach full market in the Indian context, it might be a very different market. It might look like nothing like internet in Europe and North America. So that's the other argument. So we have no time to do research. We have no time to design scientifically rigorous research experiments, go out and collect the information, and then use that evidence to produce policy. So you have so the supporters of CIS and the supporters of network neutrality want us to speak on a topic which have both these problems, a complex problem, and there is no time to produce research. So now we should perhaps quote Manu Joseph. Manu Joseph has written an article, I can't remember where, I think it's Hindustan Times, where he says that all the supporters of network neutrality are internet mullahs. Of course, supporters of network neutrality on the right-wing publications are called communists and regulatory hawks and various other things, but internet mullahs I thought was the most interesting way to describe somebody who believes in network neutrality. So, because the argument there is that instead of doing evidence-based policy making, what the internet mullahs are doing is they're trying to inform policy using ideology, using dogma, right? So now we have these two worlds that we have to deal with. On the one hand, and we've seen it before, it's not completely new, we have what is called principle-based regulation. So in a privacy bill, for example, privacy principles are articulated, and then the office of the regulator looks at the principles and then goes into detailed regulation about what data controllers can or cannot do with personal information. So we've seen it before. It's not completely alien to the world of regulation to start from principles, but they seem to be at conflict, at least for somebody unschooled. Most of you might be better educated, so you might know the fundamental difference between principle-based regulation and perhaps evidence-based regulation. So I try to connect it to certain things I have been reading and following, especially in the area of philosophy of science, and wondered whether there is any merit to going about principle-based or dogma-based regulation. How do we defend? What could be potentially a defense for designing regulation based on ideology and dogma, right? So I go back to Soren Kierkegaard, and what Soren Kierkegaard does is he says that there are two types of truth. The first type of truth are objective truths, and these are truths that are best understood and explained using the scientific method, and these truths can be communicated directly. And then Kierkegaard, of course, is talking about ethics and morality and spirituality, but not policy, but he says that the second category of truth is subjective truth. And subjective truth, according to Kierkegaard, cannot be established using the scientific method, and it cannot be communicated directly either. It has to be communicated indirectly. Kierkegaard looks at Jesus and his parables and how individuals, after hearing the parables, somehow absorb the subjective truth. So an example of a question that can be answered using objective truth is what degree does water boil at what degree Celsius does water boil at? You can design a scientific method, and everybody who follows that scientific experiment will arrive at the very same fact or truth, single objective truth. And a question about why you shouldn't cheat in life is perhaps not borne out on evidence, because those who cheat are usually more successful than those who don't. So the evidence says that you should cheat, but still, for some reason, it is commonly accepted as a truth in many societies that you should not cheat. So that's it's a version of subjective truth in Kierkegaard's thinking. So similarly then, but it's not as if Kierkegaard is opposed to the scientific method. He's not saying that we should try and reduce scientific research and give up on the idea that somehow the world can be explained scientifically. He's just reminding us that there is a limit to what we might be able to understand using the scientific method. I think that's the point. That's the main point that we should focus on. So we should be humble, perhaps, and know the limits of our knowledge. But at the same time, Kierkegaard is an existentialist, and therefore, existentialists are not satisfied by allowing intellectual analysis to reduce us to a state of inaction, because that's what CIS is doing, right? CIS has no opinion on network neutrality because we claim we don't understand the phenomena. Because through the scientific method, we cannot explain or predict anything, right? Existentialists believe that the whole point is that thought and action should be synergistically combined, and thought and action follow together. You can't just lie on bed as Sartre's hero and be in a state of rigor mortis. You have to do something. So when we go into the world of subjective truth, we can already begin to act if we decide that dogma, ideology, principles, etc. are worthy starting points for action. And I'll give you an example of what could be such a principle. When it comes to the internet, one principle that you will hear in many different versions is the principle of decentralization. It's also called the principle of subsidiarity. It's also called intelligence on the edge, and having a dumb network in the middle. So in many different ways people talk about this principle, and maybe that is the principle that is worth defending using policy. And we need to be super conservative, because the moment we allow a proliferation of principles, then it becomes very complicated for us to defend each of these principles and to say why regulation should emerge or emanate from those principles. So we need the minimum number of principles possible, and in a sense these principles should be axiomatic. So I'm going to move a little bit away from how Kierkegaard is looking at it. So with the Aadhaar project, if we have a centralized database, then it is technically possible for the centralized database to be compromised. And as long as something is technically possible, no amount of regulation is going to eliminate the technical possibility, right? So if you decide to ignore the decentralization principle or ideology or dogma that emerges from the design of the internet, the history of the internet, and you design a single store for all the biometrics of everybody in the country, and as long as it's technically possible for it to be compromised, it's like what Sherlock Holmes says. Once you've eliminated the impossible, everything that remains, however improbable, is a candidate for what might have happened, right? So there is no point fighting with that principle, because that principle, if the Aadhaar project was based on smart cards and everybody's biometrics were stored on their smart card, there is no central point of failure. There is no single place where somebody can compromise everybody's biometrics. Yeah? So why would you do research? Why would you build a centralized database and then wait for empirical evidence that the database will be compromised? You see, there's no point of entering into the scientific method if the principle is clear, and if the principle is almost axiomatic in the way that it works. Because in a sense, this market, as Lawrence Lessig said, is configured, or the phenomena as overall is configured through code and norms and law and economics. The market itself can shape the phenomena, right? And if one layer can completely eliminate a certain possibility, then that's the way, which is technology, then that's the way you should play. This could also be perhaps connected a little bit to Nicholas Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragility, but again, the analogy is a bit weak. In Anti-Fragility, Nicholas Nassim Taleb is asking us, how do we live in a world that we don't understand? And he says that all the statistical methods and all the things we know in economics will not help us predict black swan events, such as a stock market crash. So the effort should not be to bank more on the scientific method, which is more and more accurate modeling in order to understand the phenomena, and so that's a holy grail problem. You're never going to be able to predict the black swan. We should just give up on modeling. Instead, he says we should fix the system by increasing its resilience, and anti-fragility and resilience are very closely connected concepts with a very small difference, which is something is anti-fragile if after the attempt to kill it, from the phrase, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger, right? So if the entity becomes stronger, then it's anti-fragile. If the entity is just able to withstand the stress, then it's a resilient entity. So apparently, according to Nicholas Nassim Taleb, if you go to a gym, and on the first day, if you lift a 10 kilo weight, then the way your body reacts is on the next day, your body prepares to lift a 12 kilo weight. Yeah, that's the human body, or a hydra. You cut one head off, and 3 heads grow in replacement. So that is, and what does Nicholas Nassim Taleb say about making financial systems resilient? Decentralize them. So you can see in a completely different field, decentralization is the core working principle. And again, Nicholas Nassim Taleb is saying, you don't need to prove that scientifically. It just eliminates the possibility, and therefore, and here the possibility for us is that because of the way the market is configured, ISPs and telcos can play gatekeepers. And because they can play gatekeepers, they could cause certain harms. That's the concern. They will start interfering with traffic, and the internet will no longer be the competitive place it used to be. And the harms commonly associated with network neutrality violations are 1, free speech harms, 2, competition harms, 3, innovation harms, 4, diversity harms, 5, privacy harms, and 6, security harms. Is that all obvious, or should I go into some of them? Free speech harms because of blocking. Competition harms because of throttling. 2 competing services, one service gets high-speed access, the other doesn't. Innovation harms if ISPs act as gatekeepers or telcos act as gatekeepers, and you have to give them money to be featured in internet.org or free basics, then emerging actors, those who are hoping to disrupt the market, will not be able to enter the market because now there is a gatekeeper that previously didn't exist. Diversity, on free basics you only get news from the Times of India group, but in India we have, 6,000 newspapers, I forget, some huge number. And how come we don't get that very same diversity on net? Free basics. Privacy, because all your traffic to the 26 different destinations on free basics all goes through the Facebook proxy, and therefore Facebook knows what you're doing on those 26 websites. That type of monitoring of surveillance by an intermediary didn't exist before. It existed indirectly through ad networks, but not in this sense. And additionally, the first version of free basics did not even support HTTPS, which is encryption on the web protocol. And security harms which are associated, security and privacy being 2 sides of the same coin. If there is compromise of privacy, then there will also be necessary compromise of security. So those are the harms. It's a complex system. We want to embrace a couple of key principles, as few as possible, because too many principles will just add to regulatory complexity. Then we'll find it harder and harder to implement those principles. And we now have to decide what to do, right? What regulatory action we should take. When it comes to regulating individuals, the regulatory spectrum is much more confined. You can ban something, you can forbear and allow it completely, or you can tax it. Suppose you want to reduce harmful behavior in a society, such as consumption of alcohol, or tobacco, then you can tax it. I mean, there are limited things that you can do when it comes to regulating humans, also because there are far too many humans within a jurisdiction, and if the regulation is very complicated, then you're not going to pull it off successfully. So it's better to keep the regulatory continuum for citizens, or consumers, much more simple. When it comes to corporations, the regulatory continuum has massive options, right? Years and years of regulating corporations, and therefore we can do all sorts of things. So on one end we have forbearance, and I'm not sure I'm doing this properly, and I think some of them may be more intrusive than other options, so they don't come in the order that I'm going to go through them, but still bear me out. Then you could ask for transparency, that you should be transparent about what you do. So network operators should tell us when they're throttling different things. So you can throttle BitTorrent, but you need to tell us that you're throttling BitTorrent. Then you can go on to mandatory disclosure, which is not to the public, but just to the regulator. Some kind of traffic data can go to the regulator. You could ask people to register their zero rating schemes, or you could ask them that it should be approved. So there could be a licensing regime. One is just that everybody knows that the scheme exists. The other is where explicit permission is given. You could even charge for some kind of licensing fees. Like Professor V. Sridhar, you could insist on a ceiling and floor for quality of service. So Professor V. Sridhar's proposal to try, in his submission, he says that we should allow technological innovation. The networks are not dumb anymore. The networks are full of smart devices. All the devices that route the packets on the network can now differentiate between packets. They can tell that this is torrent traffic, they can tell this is gaming traffic, and so on. So what Professor V. Sridhar says is for both price and for speed, the regulator will set a ceiling and floor. But apart from that ceiling and floor, the classic internet should always be provided on a best effort basis. The internet today has no quality of service assurance. The way the internet works today is because you have prohibited traffic management. Every packet travels on the internet based on best effort, what each operator can do within the best of their capabilities, and there's no guarantee given to the consumer that the video gaming experience will be perfect, or the video streaming will be uninterrupted, or your VoIP call or your video conferencing call will be without any interruptions, right? No ISP can offer those guarantees. What Professor V. Sridhar says is, maybe because of all the sophisticated technology, they should at a variety of price points, but for both price and speed, we set ceiling and floor, and also allow for classic internet to avoid any of the harms that we've listed, especially innovation harms, etc. So price control is another option, QoS control, price control. Then options like FRAND. If you are going to set up a walled garden, then on a fair, reasonable and non-discriminatory basis, you must have a rate sheet, and then anybody who wants to enter the walled garden should be allowed to enter the walled garden. Another type of regulation. From the broadcast era, we can have must carry and must provide regulations. So this is one of the ideas that I really like, which is for 1 hour, if you keep people trapped in the walled garden, and if they consume 50 MB of data in the walled garden, then for the next hour, you give the same 50 MB but for the full internet, right? So it's a must provide obligation. Or some people say, like Steve Song, who is the inventor of Village Telco, he says that you must provide 2G zero rated, and then if they get into the app, and which is net basics, and they want to access those destinations, you can give a higher speed for those destinations. So here we come to a related concept, which is equal rating. So there are a variety of options or business models emerging across the world where you try and eliminate many of the harms associated with zero rating, by ensuring that the user can access all internet destinations for free. So in Bangladesh, Mozilla has a project where you watch a 20-second ad on your phone, and then you get 5 MB of data for that day. So that is the Bangladeshi model. Jana is a company that operates in Brazil and also operates in India. And there you are zero rated within the App Store, and you can keep installing and uninstalling a set of apps, and you can also keep engaging with those apps. And as long as you do certain set of transactions with those apps in the App Store in a zero rated fashion, then you will get equal rating of a certain amount of data. 50 MB of data will be given to you. With so much of activity per day in the App Store, you'll get 50 MB of general data. On equal rating means all destinations are fine. So you see that there are variety of options now in front of us. And where we disagree a bit with the Save the Internet campaign is that the Save the Internet campaign today wants us to exercise the last regulatory option, which is banning zero rating. Right? As far as CIS is concerned, there are two views, one held by my colleague Pranesh Prakash, and his view is that ex ante and ex post, exactly what the DOT panel has said, each zero rating service must be evaluated by the regulator, and then the regulator must approve or prohibit that particular model. And my suggestion is that we take more aggressive options, such as the leaky walled garden, where part of the time you're stuck in the walled garden and part of the time you're free of the walled garden. Those will be better at addressing the harms, because even FRAND does not fully address some of the innovation harms. So that is just to sketch out our positions today of the Save the Internet campaign and my organization, and how we are still different. We are in conversation. I spent the whole morning yesterday with the leader of the Save the Internet campaign, and we were trying to find common ground. We are nervous about this business of banning because we are not sure if we completely ban those type of activities that innovation, business model and technical innovation will continue. So we'd like to protect that, because those who claim that that type of innovation is not useful want to go back to the past. They want the old internet, where it was just a bunch of intelligent devices on the periphery and a completely dumb network. But that bird has flown. We don't have that internet anymore. We now have an intelligent network, and some of those things we really appreciate. So when I'm on a 3G network, the video will stream at a particular speed or a particular resolution, and if I'm on an edge network, the resolution will degrade automatically. I will still get to watch the video, but at a degraded resolution, and that we like. We are happy with those types of intelligence which is user demanded, but still provided from within the core of the network, or sometimes the destination. So now I'll share some other ideas that have emerged, because I don't know how much time I have, but go ahead. 15 minutes more. So I'll share some other ideas which I've heard, because I'm writing a paper for the Global Commission on Internet Governance, and I'm trying to understand or accurately represent the network neutrality debate in 3 countries: India, Brazil and South Africa. And I thought I'd share some of the learnings from those interviews and also help you understand what is going on. So why does Mark Zuckerberg go to Brasilia? Why does he have a meeting with Dilma Rousseff? Why does Dilma Rousseff wear the Facebook hoodie and then take a selfie with Mark Zuckerberg? Why does Narendra Modi go to the town hall in San Francisco? And what's happening? So one cynical view of all these developments is that the Brazilian president and the Indian Prime Minister are selling us out to these multinational corporations, and they are signaling the regulator to go easy on network neutrality violations. That is one view, right? But I would like to propose that there's something else going on, and the way I'd like to characterize it is internet governance by theater. So both the Brazilian market and the Indian market are not financially important for Facebook, at least not today. It might be 5 years down the line, but today these are not financially important markets. In Brazil, after wearing the Facebook hoodie, apparently Dilma Rousseff took Mark Zuckerberg behind closed doors and told him, if you want to escape action under Brazilian consumer protection law, you should change the name of the service, because internet.org is misrepresentation. So apparently the idea that we should shift from internet.org to free basics emerged after the Dilma Rousseff meeting with Mark Zuckerberg. In India, because of the big outcry from Save the Internet campaign on two issues, security and this business of non-exclusivity or exclusivity, two huge compromises or two huge modifications in the project after the loud complaining in April and May, I think. The first, HTTPS was re-enabled. So the communication that you have with Wikipedia, for example, through the Facebook proxy is encrypted all the way to Wikipedia. Facebook knows that you're accessing Wikipedia, but they don't know which page you're reading on Wikipedia. So that's a huge improvement. The second, Facebook published a minimum technical requirements document, and that document says, and they basically put out a statement that said, anybody who complies with that minimum technical requirements document just has to go onto our website and register their service, and thus their service will also be added to the 26 that are currently featured on the Indian version of NetBasics. So we dealt with the exclusivity harm on the side of the OTT or the over-the-top provider. We still didn't deal with it completely on the side of the telco because that is not still very clear. In 11 of the 12 markets where free basics already exists, or maybe those numbers are more, it's there on my website, I'm blanking out. Facebook signs up with only one telco, and usually the telco with the second largest market share. So we don't know why they do this, but that's what they do. So that is this business of internet governance by theater, by doing a lot of drama, by ordinary citizens and politicians doing drama in Brazil and in India. Collectively, we have made internet.org less evil than it was, dramatically less evil than it was. So we have, as markets, some amount of market shaping capabilities, and we should exercise it. So in that sense, that is one way to look at it. The second thing to say, from the Indian context, is the work done by Vidya-mitra, and you should absolutely go onto the internet and watch the Vidya-mitra luncheon lecture on network neutrality. And he comes up with the game theory solution for the problem. And there are two sides to the solution. One is, it is a multi-sided market, and using Shapley value, and the lecture is the best way to understand it, you can decide who should pay who how much. Because part of the request from the Indian telcos is that, look, for every $100 we earn, we have to give $28 back to the government, either as tax, or as license fees, or as royalty for the spectrum, or as contribution to the Universal Service Obligation Fund, and so on. So our businesses are on wafer-thin profits, but the OTTs, they don't even pay tax. Apparently the tax that Facebook paid in the UK was less, last year was less than what an individual taxpayer will pay in the UK as tax. So they avoid tax because they operate out of tax havens like the Netherlands and Ireland, and they deploy techniques such as the double Irish and Dutch sandwich in order to avoid paying taxes. And therefore, please tax them, please place them under some kind of licensing regime. So that was the ask on the side of the telcos. And Vishal Mishra says, to simplify the multi-sided market, you have content providers, and then content ISPs that serve the content providers, and then you have transit ISPs in between the content ISPs and the other set of ISPs that are client-facing. Those are called eyeball ISPs, and then you have consumers. So between those four actors, the way to split up the profits is the Shapley value optimization problem, and that's fine. Then everything will be done. But unfortunately, all these deals between the eyeball ISPs, the transit ISPs are the guys running the undersea cable and doing the long haul lifting of data, and the content ISPs, none of those contracts are available or currently regulated. So that's an area that most probably won't work, because it's such a complex thing for governments to start monitoring and regulating. So that's not going to happen. The other solution, the scientific solution, is eliminate all caps and fair use policies and so on. Let every consumer pay directly based on the MB they consume. So people that abuse the system using BitTorrent will be penalized because they will have to pay extra. But consumers hate that. Consumers want predictability in their monthly billing. Consumers don't want to decide whether they have to pay more or less before they watch every single YouTube video. So even though majority of the consumers consume less than what they should be consuming or are entitled to consume, and few torrent users take most of the network resources, nobody is willing to move to that proposal. Okay. The first telco that does this will be in big trouble, because, or ISP that does in big trouble, because they might just lose consumers, right? So again, we come back to this problem of the scientific method. Through the scientific method, there are policy solutions, but those policy solutions won't work in the market. So we have to sacrifice on our obsession with the scientific method, right? So that was just quickly stuff that I heard from Vishal Mishra, and I'm oversimplifying it. Go to his Twitter account. You can see the troll fests between him and my colleague Pranesh Prakash. And his pinned tweet on his Twitter account is very interesting, that the internet is a platform where the access provider does not provide a competitive advantage to any of the entities. That's a very interesting way of defining the internet, because I'll come back to definitions a bit, but that's important to get our definitions right. And then his lecture, his luncheon lecture on Shapley values and zero rating is invaluable. So please, if you have time, watch that. And then moving on to something that I heard from the ISP Association in South Africa. And again, very strange proposal, and when we hear it the first time, we might find it hard to understand, but again, hitting at something really useful. So what the telcos in India are saying, we had lot of revenues from international calls and from national calls and from SMS, and all our traditional sources of revenue are being cannibalized by the emerging actors such as Skype. So we used to make a lot of money from voice calls. Now all that money is not made by Skype either, but Skype has other ways of making money. So we have revenue loss. We used to make a lot of money by charging people for SMSs. Now all those users have shifted to WhatsApp or comparable services. Now we don't make money from messaging, so we have revenue loss. So this is the big complaint from the Indian market. But if you think through it very carefully, on the 4G networks, it's all data. So even on 3G, it was mostly data. It's data. Voice is also being carried as data packets. From a technical perspective, on a 4G network, there is no such thing as voice. So you have an outdated billing model being slapped onto a completely new technology. So what the ISP Association in South Africa is saying is, just prohibit billing based on minutes. Prohibit that type of billing. Let everybody shift completely to the new paradigm. Then nobody will have any complaints, right? Let everybody pay based on data. But let everybody pay based on the way they use the network, and then through billing itself, consumers will be signaled, and then they will know whether to consume more data or less data and so on. So that's an interesting solution that has been proposed by the ISP Association in South Africa. In Brazil, the strange view from the technical community is that network neutrality is only about the network. It's about what the network does. It's how the network treats packets. Business models have nothing to do with network neutrality. And competition abuse has nothing to do with network neutrality. Network neutrality is the regulation of the network. This is what the technical community in Brazil tell me. So therefore, the regulatory problem needs to be split up. When we have a service which is actually a walled garden being promoted under the name internet.org, take it to the consumer court and complain there, misrepresentation of service, deal with it there. When you have a walled garden and people operating in an anti-competitive fashion, go to the Competition Commission, complain there, get it sorted out there. Only what remains, which is throttling, is the business of network neutrality policy. But if you speak to civil society in Brazil, they say, oh, that's completely unacceptable, because the sectoral regulator will know much more about how to regulate network neutrality, and the competition regulator won't fully understand how the networks are configured. And even more, many of the anti-competitive actions as far as network neutrality are concerned might only have innovation harms. That might not meet the threshold which the Competition Commission needs. The Competition Commission needs abuse of dominant position in the marketplace. That's a higher threshold. And you find it difficult to prove that. And therefore, the Competition Commission shouldn't be involved. So in terms of simplicity of the regulatory framework, in terms of competence of the regulator, better to keep it with the Ministry of Justice in the case of Brazil, because like the US, because of the Title III, Title IV distinction, the Brazilian telecom regulator cannot publish network neutrality rules. In India, under the TRI Act, the Indian regulator can publish network neutrality rules. In Brazil, it is different. So that's another interesting insight, because in India also, Payal Malik, who used to be the advisor to the Competition Commission, and also Ved Vyas has published a recent article from Observer Research Foundation, all of them making the argument that let's not wait for the TRI to publish network neutrality rules. If there are competition harms, let's just deal with it using the Competition Commission of India. So that's the perspective from Brazil. All of you are young people, and perhaps some of you would want to take research as a career, and some of you might want to get your hands dirty when you are still in school. So I thought I will provoke you and give you some ideas about what could be potential research exercises. There is a researcher who comes from Oxford Internet Institute. Her name is Amba Kak, and she's the only person, as far as I can tell, who has done interviews of users. And she basically placed herself at a mobile top-up store or a mobile service center that also sells data and voice minutes and so on. And she tried to see why people buy zero-rated packets, why people add zero-rated bundles to the service that they're buying. And she found two things that are surprising and that give us some insight into the debate today. The first, it isn't as if zero rating increases access. It isn't as if somebody who previously was not consuming data is now purchasing a zero rated bundle. That means you take so many megabits of regular internet, but you also pay for unlimited WhatsApp, or you also pay for unlimited Facebook. It comes together, and on the Facebook pack there is no monitoring of your usage. You can use as much. So she found that it wasn't as if people that previously were low data consumers are now purchasing these zero rated packs to increase usage, but rather people who are already high consumers of data are now reducing what they should pay the company by using the pack. So I'm a high user of Facebook already, and I realize that if I buy the pack, my bill will become smaller. So it's a way, so the consumer is rather smart and therefore knows what they're doing. The second is the opposite of what was presented at the sci-fi conference, where the minister also spoke. The minister mentioned Facebook something like 4 times in his speech at the sci-fi conference. And immediately after that, Samir Saran of Observer Research Foundation put out a slide deck, and the last slide on the slide deck said that 90% of Indians are 90% of the time in Facebook, and therefore Facebook should be considered the internet, right? So that's the most stupid way to argue something. And my stupid defense of that is 90% of the time we don't spend 90% of our time defecating, and therefore defecation is not important to human beings, right? So that's meaningless. But what Amba does is she digs a little deeper into that and finds that there are a variety of reasons why ordinary users want the whole internet. And even though they spend 90% of their time in Facebook, it doesn't mean that that 10% is not important or critical. So emergency services, because she was a female researcher, she couldn't fully understand how pornography affected usage, because people didn't open up and share. But definitely what we require, despite of my defense of principle-based regulation or dogma-based regulation, is more research from the ground that will tell us what is really going on and how some of these harms are occurring in the marketplace or not. So that is what I want to say. Sorry for going on.